Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Welcome to the Diverse Thinking, Different Learning podcast. I am absolutely thrilled to introduce you to my guest, Dr. Bibi Pirayesh. Dr. Pirayesh is a learning specialist and an educational therapist who has been in private practice for over a decade. While the emphasis of Dr. Pirayesh's work is on remediating learning disabilities in a one-on-one setting, she's also a sought-after speaker and community advocate for children and families around learning rights. Bibi works with children grades 1 through 12 and covers a wide range of learning difficulties, including dyslexia, ADHD, and spectrum disorders. Dr. Pirayesh completed her doctoral work at Loyola Marymount University, where she is also faculty and involved with a number of service organizations, including the Association of Educational Therapists. Thank you so much for agreeing to be on the podcast, Bibi. I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
Hi, Karen. Thank you for having me.
Now, you and I both work with kids who struggle with learning challenges, neurodevelopmental disorders, social emotional difficulties, things that impact learning. And I see kids on the assessment side where I'm evaluating and identifying the issues that need to be addressed. And then I refer them to people like you who really do the work to help kids develop the skills they need in order to be successful. Now, I'd love to hear a little bit about what made you get into the field that you're in.
So I came into educational therapy almost accidentally, and I came to it from a different route than I think most people do. I was in the sort of academia research world for the first part of my career. I was really interested in the science behind how learning happens in the brain. And, I really wanted to understand cognitive science, which was like a very big emerging field at the time that I was coming up in school. So I think that originally my interest in learning was using a very different lens. And then I really wanted to see what the actual application of a lot of the research that I had been doing or others were doing was. And so I just kind of started one-on-one work with kids mostly to observe them. I still very much had my researcher hat on when I started. But then once I started doing work with families and with kids, I just really fell in love with it. And I felt that the type of supports that an educational therapist is able to give, both around reading difficulties, but also around other issues like, navigating things at home, navigating things in school. It's a really, really unique position to be in. And I found myself just getting such gratification from the work that I sort of stuck with it. And, the other aspects still really, really interest me. But I think it sort of awakened this teacher in me that I almost didn't even know was in there. So that's how I came to the work. And I worked primarily in the West LA area. I still do work in that region, which, as you know, is a very unique place.
Yes.
And after about 7 or 8 years in that area, I really began to notice larger structural issues that were becoming problematic for me. And I think that that's, again, something that really changed the direction of my work and my thinking. But I came to the field from a different angle. I had no background in, I didn't have a teaching credential or a special ed degree or anything like that. I came in with a science degree and learned teaching by doing.
Right. And I think that's just such a unique perspective because we know that the science teaches us a lot about neurodevelopmental disorders, differences in the way kids learn. And I think there's an advantage when you have that perspective that you can apply to the work that you do. And you look at it through that lens because you know by doing the work that you do, you actually help reorganize the brain in a way that allows kids to be more efficient and also experience more success.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's really helpful to have the science background to be able to support the work and to also be able to tell apart what works from what doesn't, what's fad from what's real. Because in fields like ours, as you know, there does also, when parents are so concerned and so worried and so desperate to do anything that it takes to help their children, unfortunately, there tends to develop around that an economy, I guess you could say, that really tries to take advantage. And so having that background was also really helpful for me in being able to give people guidelines that they need to follow instead of programs that they need to buy or, places that they need to go and sign up. So that's, I think, has also been really helpful in my work, both in terms of the actual remediation work that I do, but also in the social justice aspect of it.
Right. And I really want to touch on that social justice aspect. But I really want parents to have a good idea of what is it that you do when you're working with a child who is struggling? Because I know kids come to you for a number of different reasons. You mentioned reading. You mentioned kind of navigating the academic system. I know a lot of kids that I refer out to individuals like you who struggle with organization and planning and written expression and just demonstrating what it is that they know. So can you tell us a little bit about how you work with kids and how you help them?
Sure. So I tend to take a processing skills lens to learning. So I'm always interested in understanding, sort of what are the underlying learning skills that we know children need to have, or sometimes they're referred to as neurodevelopmental constructs. So things like the things that, neuropsychologists like you test for. So memory, attention, processing speed, sort of the entire gamut, because the way we know from the way that, brain development happens is that things kind of develop on top of each other. So it's really, really important with assessment to go down and see where the issues are. And then it's really important to provide targeted intervention for those particular issues. Now, obviously, there are ways in which these difficulties cluster together that help us kind of give it a name. So, for example, if a student has an ADHD diagnosis, or if a student has a dyslexia diagnosis, or not that it would be called that, but sort of under that umbrella, we know that there are certain clusters that we need to look for in terms of what's going to be not working the way that it needs to. But generally speaking, I really try to understand where a student is a lot, like at the root level, and then build step by step on top. So it might be that a student comes to me, for example, for a reading difficulty. But if I know that the real issue is a sound processing issue, or the real issue is that they can't really, tell apart, for example, the sounds of speech, that's the level that we're going to have to work on first. It doesn't make sense for me to try and explicitly teach them the reading code because they can't hear the sounds in the ways that they need to. So I really try alongside, obviously, I think any good therapist is always working in an alliance, working alongside other people, other experts. And I think that's also one of the ways in which educational therapists have a potentially really, really important role, because it oftentimes ends up being the ed therapist who really brings in, for example, the speech language pathologist or the occupational therapist, the psychologist, the neurodevelopmental, whoever the people are, the educational therapist becomes the central person that is supposed to understand all these different aspects and then obviously help the child and the family as well as the school navigate all that. So that also ends up being a really, really big part of my work. So I would say when I take on a client, it's probably like 60-40, 60% of our efforts and time, or my effort and time, is spent on the actual remediation work. And then a big chunk of it is also spent just, because as kids are, they don't live in a vacuum. So it's not like I can just take them away to some island where they don't have any other responsibilities or things that they need to do, and we're just going to work on remediation. They have to be able to function and sort of get through their day-to-day life while we're doing, the work that we need to do. So a big part of my job is also just helping students, getting through the school, whatever the demands happen to be on them. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, that does. That absolutely does. Because I think sometimes when parents see their kids struggle and they get an evaluation and they have kind of a roadmap of what to do, then they go and see people like you. And then they want to know, well, what are you doing in your sessions with them that's going to help them be more successful in the work that they do at school? How can they better access their curriculum? How can they better demonstrate their knowledge more fully? And how do you know that they are benefiting from the intervention? Because I think that's one of the things that we're looking at right now at this time of distance learning. We're recording this in the midst of the COVID pandemic, where parents are now having to monitor their child's progress.
Right.
And I'm wondering, how do you look at progress? And what does that look like? And I know obviously it'll look different for different kids.
Yeah. I mean, there's certain certain kinds of progress that's really easy to measure, right? So for example, if there's like a sound processing issue and a child doesn't even, know their beginning sounds, and then 6 months down the line, they know all their sounds and can, blend them and, pull them apart and spell and read and all that. That's a pretty easy thing to assess in terms of progress. But a lot of the progress that we sometimes forget to really look at and forget to give kids credit for, or give ourselves or even parents credit for, because obviously it really does take a village with things like this, is so much of the work is about helping kids own their learning and, demystify the entire learning process for themselves. I mean, there's oftentimes when you have a kid that has whatever kind of learning disability, there's such a huge intimidation factor and shutdown factor because they know something is wrong. They usually don't know what it is. They're really, really scared of admitting to it. There's a lot of social stigma, depending on where you are, but there can be a lot of stigma. They're so concerned about letting their parents down. The parents you oftentimes carry a lot of shame because they're like, oh my God, I didn't do something wrong, or there's something wrong with my child, or there's something wrong with my parenting. So there's a lot of emotions to manage there. And I think that much of the time, the most important component of my work is about helping everyone involved come on this journey where they really learn to unpack all this, take a look at it, stop being so overwhelmed and scared, really own it piece by piece, begin to see that little by little they can make progress. They can feel better about learning, because that's one of the number one reasons that kids misbehave or drop out or shut down or act out, whatever it is because the entire process just has such a negative feeling for them. And so they're running away from that negative feeling. And when you're able to really sit with someone and slowly go through, you're slowly able to help them move away from that negative and get to a place where things feel more doable, and then they can slowly begin to experience success. Because that's what the brain naturally does. All brains are equipped. They're naturally designed to learn and to grow and to expand. That's where we feel most alive and most like ourselves. And when we're able to help a child really understand what are the things that are getting in the way of that natural flow, and what are some ways that we can work around that and get still to that flow at whatever level works for them, then then the hardest part is done, because then they're motivated, then they're willing, then they trust, then they, start to initiate. And so, there is definitely this therapeutic sort of work that needs to happen. And it takes a lot of patience, and it takes a lot of, especially, I mean, right now with COVID, I feel like we're living in a different world, but traditionally, we live in a world where there's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of pressure on kids. There's a lot of pressure on parents. Everyone has to perform. The school system has essentially pushed everything down. So, it used to be that we did algebra in 7th grade. Now we're doing it in 4th grade. And sure, maybe you can make the argument that there's some kind of collective development so that kids today are able to tackle things at an earlier age. But I do think that generally speaking, our expectations have gotten so high that nothing that we do feels enough. And I think that this is actually one of the really, really big gifts of kids who just don't function in the ways that we expect them to. I think that they really call on us to slow down and to reconsider and to get involved and engage with the learning process in a much more meaningful way than when when we have a straight A student who's just like going through and not even thinking about it. So yeah, that was a long-winded way of answering.
No, I just think that's so accurate, because what you're describing is the scenario where kids have just struggled, and they've just struggled and struggled and struggled, and they lose the motivation for learning. And part of what you're doing is you're increasing their motivation for learning. You're increasing their love of learning, and you're helping them realize that they can learn, because for so long, so many students who have failed or experienced failure, difficulties, just feel like they're not a good student. And then they take on that identity. I'm just not a good student. Right. I just can't learn. It's too hard. But then you break it down in a way that reveals to them that that's actually not true.
There's the saying, all learning is remembering. And I think that that's really true for kids, because kids always love to learn. They always, they come out of the womb that way. And what happens, unfortunately, is through our schooling process and through these sort of man-made constructs that we've developed, we erode that. We take away, we chip away at that. And so by the time that they get to whatever, a certain level, they're done. Like you said, they have this identity of, this is just not for me. And it's, for me, it's not so much about motivating them or, getting them to love learning. It's more about getting them to remember, getting them to go back to who they really are and who they've always been, and helping them to see that, these things that we have here that they need to do these are just man-made constructs. These are things that we've invented based on a very limited way of seeing the world. And so that to me is also a social justice issue, really helping kids and families see that being able to, and this is, from someone, I always did fine in school. I never really had issue with it, but the realization that the way that our formal education system, our Western formal education system works is it's a very linear, limited thing. And so if you don't fit into this box, it doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It's just a very limited box. Obviously, they still have to be able to, you can't get through in our world without knowing how to read, or how to do, basic math. But it's really important that we distinguish between learning and learning this particular thing that I am telling you need to learn. I mean, as we know, reading it's not like language. It's not an innate ability. It's a learned skill. I like to think, and this is an area that I would love to do more research on, but I like to think that before we had formal schooling, children, whose brains we now identify as dyslexic and they're just wired differently and blah, 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 they provided a very, very, very important function in society and were not pathologized in the ways that we pathologize kids now. But our measuring sticks have become very limited. And so I really do think that so much of the work is about helping kids to realize all of that.
Those are such excellent points because I'm thinking about the increase in academic demands that you've described. And what we know from the literature and the research is that about 10 to 15% of kids struggle with learning difficulties that constitute a learning disorder. But as we increase those academic demands, those kids who might have been average students or borderline in terms of learning struggles and may just have learning differences are now going to struggle significantly in an academic environment where the academic demands are too high for that child.
Right, exactly. I mean, it's sort of in areas like West Los Angeles or, I don't know, the Upper West Side in New York where people are able to afford things. You know, there's running jokes about how everyone has an educational therapist now, or everyone has a neuropsych evaluation now. And I 100% agree with you. I think nothing about that is surprising, though. You know, when you look at kind of the historical roots of our education system, and when you look at the purpose ultimately of our education system, nothing about that is surprising. I mean, there's a constant demand for higher, better production. And that's what schooling has become. I mean, schooling, is not sort of this ideal engagement with civic society and democracy that we sometimes pretend or like to think. I mean, our entire, there's a great, literature behind this that, you know, our entire education system is really just, it's mirroring factory systems. And it's really just about getting people in there, getting them ready to get out there to produce and to become consumers. And, you know, if we continue to go on that path, this is exactly what keeps happening. And so slowly what we're seeing is, you know, childhood is getting more and more diminished and more and more diminished. And the demand on human beings, the higher demands are starting earlier and earlier. And everyone is always burnt out. Everyone is always, you know, again, feeling like they're just not doing enough and there's not enough time. And it takes, you know, and now we have like a whole other new economy about how to learn to relax and how to learn to de-stress and all of these things that we wouldn't need to do if we didn't force ourselves to participate in this ridiculous system. So yeah, so it's become, to me, education should be about the business of being human and becoming human. But unfortunately, I feel like so much of our work now is about undoing all the damage, you know, and trying to remind people that actually we're supposed to be here to be human. We're not supposed to be here to produce and get a great job and go to a great college and, you know, all of those things. So, I mean, these are obviously much larger, cultural issues, but I don't think there's a way to speak about any of these issues without considering the larger culture. And then, of course, now with everything that's going on with COVID, I mean, you know, as stressful and difficult as it's been, I really see it as this great gift from above to really force us all to reevaluate and to come back to the pace that we're naturally supposed to be at, as opposed to this, you know, pace on speed or whatever that we've all been for such a long time.
Right. And we're seeing it in a number of different ways. When you talk about kind of the gift of this time, we're seeing it kind of in this return to basics, where a lot of parents are saying that they've got the school assignments and there's a lot of optional in parentheses. You know, science is optional, social studies is optional, but they want the kids to read and do math, right? So we're coming back to the basics in terms of what kids need to know. And we're also seeing the importance of the social and emotional aspect of learning. And that when we don't have that context for learning, it takes away from the learning experience for so many kids and also decreases the motivation for learning. So we're seeing that. But we're also seeing, when you talk about social justice issues, we're seeing the disparities in the experience of kids in the education system. You know, we've seen it in terms of accessing digital information from schools, but also we've seen it prior to COVID in terms of access to a good evaluation that identifies the struggles that you have, access to appropriate interventions. You talked about the work you do in terms of getting targeted interventions, evidence-based interventions. There's so much research on what works for kids who struggle with reading, for example. And yet a lot of kids aren't getting the types of interventions that they need in order to move the needle for them. And that creates further disparities in terms of academic success, occupational outcomes, access to college, and a host of other things. So when you talk about learning differences and learning disabilities, and in the context of an educational system, you talk about a lot about this being a social justice issue. And I feel like we're at the tip of the iceberg in terms of what that means. Tell me a little bit about how you see that, because I agree with you that the discrepancies and the disparities are striking. It's become more apparent with COVID. We kind of knew it was there before, but now there's a light shining on it. So What would you like to say about that?
Well, I think that you're absolutely right. And we all have to make the decision depending on how we want to look at it, whether we see this as a good thing or a bad thing. But I do really feel strongly that, what COVID has done is to turn, it's lift the veil or turn a light on that makes it really, really difficult for us to deny, because historically, people have all kinds of arguments, about people are not working hard enough or not doing enough, or they're not trying. It's the parents, it's this, it's that. But we know that there are structural reasons why this is true. I mean, if you look at, and this is something that I've actually published on, I mean, if you look at the history of special education in our country, it's something that came out of the civil rights movements. We generally tend to equate it with the Brown versus Board of Ed, like that was sort of like the beginning of it. But if you follow that history since Brown, you begin to see that actually the way that special education law is set up and the way that it places the burden on parents and the way that schools are really just required to give access. And there's been great debate, at the Supreme Court about what that actually means. When you follow that, it's really, really easy to see that it is parents who are highly educated and who have resources and who are able to fight and who are able to get resources for their children that actually end up taking advantage of those laws. And parents who do not have any of those things, their children do not get access to any of the resources, and none of those laws protect them. So this is not something that's new. I mean, this is something that it's not a history that we like to talk about, because we like a history that sort of follows this idea of, the myth of development. Like we like to think, Brown versus Board of Ed, and then we did this, and then, IDEA, and, now we have all of these rights, and we've, disability rights is something that we've resolved in our country. But the truth of the matter is that when you kind of lift the veil, as COVID has, I mean, before it was something that you really needed to go and study. But now it's very apparent in everyone's face. Those laws are specifically designed to give advantage to people who know how to use the law to their advantage. And they are specifically designed to not work for people who don't. And so that's the reason, along with a number of other issues, that we begin to see why we have the overrepresentation of racialized children, and why we continue to have racialized kids or kids from a certain socioeconomic background never be able to catch up. And, this great rhetoric of, the American education system failing, blah, 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 as if that's not what it was designed to do. And then the people who can afford it somehow are able to close the achievement, the so-called achievement gap. So, this is something that I really began to see very clearly in my own practice. I sort of entered into practice, thinking, okay, I'm working with these kids, I'm working with whoever's coming through the door. And I'm so excited about the opportunity to help all these kids and figure out what they need, et cetera, et cetera. And then after a while, I was like, okay, well, so many of us in this field are really good at what we do. And I've had so many success cases with my clients. And this is all really, really great. But it was always the same people walking through my door. That never, over the course of a decade, there was no shift in terms of who lives in West LA, who attends these schools in West LA, who gets these evaluations, who gets these services. I mean, yes, there's it's very trendy for a lot of private schools in the name of diversity and inclusion to have scholarships that bring bus kids in from different areas, but they don't, it's not like you can just go there and suddenly you're part of this other culture. And so what I was seeing is that there's these divides, these theoretical divides that you hear about were just so blatant and so apparent that I just could not in good conscience continue to work in the same way that I was, because I was really beginning to see my own part in that and the ways in which I was contributing to this. There is this entire economy around, on the side of our public education system. And of course, in a city like Los Angeles, unfortunately, there is such a push for the privatization of education because there's such a negative narrative around public education. I mean, I grew up in LA, but I also lived on the East Coast for a long time. I lived and went to school in New York. In New York, people take pride in public education. I'm not saying that, there aren't people in private schools or the private school culture isn't there, but in Los Angeles, there is such people, the idea of sending their kids to their local public school, you would think that they're being asked to send their kids into a war zone or something. So what does that mean? And what does this mean for the kids who have no choice but to go there? And then of course, there was these larger divides that I was seeing where, we know that we have a pretty robust special education budget. And yet, you have all of these highly educated, special ed teachers, resource teachers, et cetera, et cetera. But those kids that are going through the public process they never get the help that they need, and they never remediate their learning difficulties, and they are always playing catch up. And the absolute most that they'll do for them is really dumb down the curriculum, and get them to just pass through school. And then they enter into society, maybe with a high school degree, if you're in a more liberal state, I guess, but are they really able to tackle the demands of real life? And so it's like we're constantly teaching them, you are lesser, you can't do it. And yet I see all of those same difficulties, with my wealthy, traditionally white clients, and all of those kids get the support that they need, figure out how to advocate for themselves, remediate their problems, and go on to become really successful. And in fact, even learn to maybe even create change and say, I'm very proud of my learning this, whatever it is. So all of this really positive work only happens for one group, while the other group is just kind of, and then when you try, and this is sort of part of what I really came to learn in my doctoral degree, is it's not just because I went in with these very naive definitions and, I guess you could say misinformed definitions of social justice and inclusion and diversity. It's sort of things that I'm seeing now a lot, with all the movements that we've had recently, and everyone's, putting out their equity and inclusions and diversity statements. And it just makes me mad because that is not the answer, and that is not going to do anything unless you are willing to really, it's just like working with kids. Unless you're willing to go down to the roots and really understand what's going on and remediate it and rebuild it step by step, all you're doing is putting on a Band-Aid. And ultimately you're doing it because the system sustains itself this way, and the system continues to succeed in this way. And it runs in many ways on the blood of those who have to be used in order for the system to survive. And so I don't think that there is any kind of real social justice movement without, what you might call an epistemological disruption and a decolonization of the entire system, which we're not going to have that. But that's what I really came to learn and to understand, is that there is no easy thing. Like, I can't, I was sort of this like really, really excited, naive person, like, look, we have all of these things, like neuroscience has taught us this and educational therapy this, and, we know all this stuff. Let's bring this to the kids in schools. And then you get there and you realize, well, all of those systems could arrive at these same answers and do all of these things on their own if we hadn't set up systems to prevent that from happening. And it mirrors exactly the same thing that happens for the individual student at the systemic level. So communities are organically designed to be able to figure out and solve their own problems, including, issues around learning for children in their communities. But we don't allow for that to happen. We are like, this is the system. Everybody has to get in there. That's the community. And it doesn't ever work. And there is no way to shift something like that with, a law about access to school or access to curriculum. And so the issues are much, much deeper, than the average person even has time to think about, much less really think about.
Right.
And I think that again is another way in which COVID has really been a gift, because, it's, now that parents have to sit at home and kind of go through the process with their child, they begin to see, oh yeah, well, okay, obviously this doesn't make sense. Like, this kid can't do it like this. Like, why is this a requirement? Which is something that kids feel and know, but their parents usually think like, you're not trying hard enough, or you didn't do it this way. Why don't you just ask your teacher? Like, they're now going through the process with an adult mind and resources. And they're like, well, this doesn't make sense. And so the advocacy that people like me had to do before, with teachers, where we're like, this just doesn't work for this kid. The parents can now see it. The teachers can now see it. They are all in this new system. They're beginning to experience their own learning in a way. They have an empathy, I think, for kids with learning disabilities in a way that maybe they never could have had before. And so it remains to be seen. And I mean, it's really up to us. I mean, are we going to harness all of these gifts that we've been given, or are we just going to wait until this passes and go back to business as usual? I don't know. But as a special education advocate, I just, I think this has been an incredible, incredible time. I mean, even in the smallest ways. I mean, I used to have to fight. To get teachers to say, can you please just write, like, there just be a place where all of this is written down and the student can, and now it has to be that way because everyone's on Google Classroom and everything has to be written. And I'm not saying that to say that virtual schooling is like great for kids with learning disabilities. Obviously, we know that it poses all kinds of issues for them. But I think that, these little windows are opening. And if we're paying attention, we can sort of reach through them and hopefully be able to connect with the person on the other side in ways that, because it used to always be like, this is the way, this is the system. And now COVID has made it that everything, the system has in many ways collapsed, and we're sort of figuring out a new system of our own. And so there's this opportunity to build it in ways that actually work for people. So I think that's incredible. That's incredible.
And I think what you're really identifying in this gift, as you described it, and an opportunity, is to look at the system, because you're describing a system that is broken for many kids, because some kids, like you described, are doing well because they're in a different system, but not everybody is in the same system, right? I think that's part of the problem. And so what you're describing is the fact that the system needs to change. The system needs to work in a way that increases access to services in an equitable way for kids, regardless of where you go to school and the type of school that you attend. And perhaps this is an opportunity to change the system now that, as you described, it's collapsed. And many parents would describe it that way. But there's clearly a lot of work that needs to be done. But I do agree with you. It's an opportunity to rebuild a system in a way that is more equitable.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the thing is that the system is not broken. The system is working perfectly fine, but the system was designed for only certain people, and it's working perfectly fine for them. And in any place where it doesn't work fine, we develop very quickly other systems that will all make it make sense. I think that the takeaway, we have to really, really appreciate the pace that this kind of stuff takes. It's the same thing as when you work with kids. Change happens very slowly, and it has to happen step by step. So I think the most that we can expect, the best that we can expect right now is just the realization that this system it wasn't designed for everybody. So just in recognizing that, and I don't think it's necessarily about breaking it down and rebuilding it so that it works for everybody. It's about recognizing that there's many, many, many different kinds of people. And so we need many, many, many different kinds of systems to reflect those differences. There will never be one system that's going to work for everybody. And that's another reason why, I think these, diversity and inclusion statements are kind of silly, because that goes against diversity, the idea of diversity. The idea of diversity is that you can't have one system that works for everybody. Different systems for different people. We're very, very far away from that. And the idea is not to say like, oh, the education system is so horrible, blah, blah. No, our education system is beautiful and it works really, really well for the people that it's supposed to work for. If we allow it to, it can continuously regenerate and rebuild itself in ways that it needs to, like any living system should. But there's so much more than just that. We have to be able to expand our lens. And this is what I sort of mean. This is what I talk about when I teach, research, or when I work with graduate students. I'm constantly reminding them, look, everything that we do here is based on the positivist, empirical, Western epistemology. And if you really want to train to be a scientist, you have to recognize that that is only one way of being. That is one epistemology in an infinite, potentially infinite ways of knowing the world. And so unfortunately, what we have done, and this is what happens when, we function based on fear and power. Unfortunately, what we've done is we've really, really limited ourselves, and we're looking at the world like through this very, very narrow lens, and everything that is outside of our tiny, narrow lens is scary and broken and terrible and horrible. Whereas if we just, recognize that this is just one little piece of the whole puzzle, I think that will just open everything up so that we can approach life in a much more itinerant way than the linear way that is based on our Western epistemologies. And this kind of, it's an epistemological shift that requires an ideological shift and an ideological understanding and recognition. And I think that if we can just get that recognition through this time in COVID, that in itself is everything. It's everything. Because that was not possible before. That conversation was not possible before.
And like you said, I think just having the conversation is a good first step, because again, we can't skip over steps. We talk about change. Things have to happen in a particular order in order for us to really see change. Right. But I also think about a parent who is sitting beside their child who's trying to access the curriculum via Zoom, and they're seeing their child struggle. We've got a few minutes left, and there's so much that we've discussed, and it's so big in terms of what needs to be done. And it can feel very overwhelming. But there's also some hope in this, because really what parents want is, regardless of whatever system their child is operating in, they want their child to be able to thrive within that system. And if their child is struggling with learning or accessing the curriculum, they want to know that they can get the support that their child needs in order to be successful, in order to thrive. And so for parents who are at home and they're working with their kids and they're seeing their kids struggle, maybe for the first time, what are some things that you can recommend? And I know it can vary, and it might even just start with having a conversation with the school or a teacher to start the ball rolling, to play a small part in that change. What can parents do, or do you recommend that they do when they see the struggle? And so many parents are now in the position to see it in a way that they've never seen it before.
Sure. And we could do a whole other podcast on that, as you know, and
I think we need
webinars on things like much more practical things. But sort of, since our conversation has been a little bit more like philosophical or ideological, I'll just say this. I think that things work when we remember that there is a human system that always works. So regardless of what's going on, whether it's with your child or with your child's teacher or whoever, if you move forward with the idea of connecting and empathizing and understanding, somehow miraculously, it tends to work. And, I know that right now teachers are incredibly stressed, parents are incredibly stressed, and children are incredibly stressed. And I think two mistakes that I see parents make is they either do nothing, they don't reach out, they don't communicate, they don't ask for anything, and they along with their child just carry the weight and shame of it all. Or you have the opposite, where they come in full force and they're like, you're doing this wrong, or you're not, my child can't do this. And either extreme tends to not get you the results that you want. I think one of the things that we really need to remember is that, because I think this is somewhere along the lines, this has shifted. We view our education system and we view teachers and we view classrooms as this place where we go to get assessed. Like, we go there and they're supposed to assess us and tell us whether we're good enough or not. And that automatically puts people in a really, really defensive place. Whereas the truth is that education, the relationship that you have with your child's teacher, this is supposed to be one of the most sacred relationships that you can have. The two of you are working together on how to raise a human being. There's nothing more sacred than that. But we don't see it that way. We see it in a very factory model, like this child must do this, this, and this by this, and this age. And everything that we do, from our assessments to our schooling, is based on that system of categorization. So I would say to just, for a second, because you can't dismantle the system and rebuild it and fix it, and just for a second, step away from it and try to come at it in a different way, and just try to really make a connection with a teacher and really be vulnerable and really say, I know that you're doing all of this because all of this is supposed to be really good for us, but this is how we're experiencing it. This is what's happening for us. What do you think? How could we change things? And begin a conversation. I know that that's really difficult for the average teacher who has 30 kids per class. My mom is a public school teacher at LAUSD, and sometimes when I call her at night, she's like, I've had 7 classes of 30 kids. That many interactions on Zoom. I'm spent. I'm done. But I still know that at the end of the day, that if one person reached out to her about their child, she would do everything that she can, because that's why people become teachers. So my recommendation would be to just kind of also stay in line, is to really try to humanize, really try to connect, really try to have a conversation, because ultimately, if you're able to teach your kid that skill, If you're able to teach your kid that when they're in a tough situation, they should reach out and they should make themselves vulnerable and they should ask. And it doesn't mean that it's going to work with every single teacher, or every single situation, but there is nothing going on in a classroom or with a child that two caring, committed adults, whether it's a teacher and a parent or whoever, and the child cannot figure out on their own. I really, truly believe that. And I really, of course I believe in expertise and people, contributing in other ways, but I really think that ultimately that's what education is supposed to be about. And there's no one that is unable to participate in that, because our education system is supposed to be like our democracy. It's supposed to be something that we all can participate in and that we can all contribute to and that we can all reap the benefits of. And that's just that. I know that's not the way that we normally look at it, but I think it would be a really interesting experiment, if you will, to just try it that way and see what happens. Maybe they'll be surprised.
And remember that we're raising human beings. I love that. Bibi, this has been an incredible conversation. I feel like there needs to be a part 2, maybe a post-COVID part 2. But I'm so grateful to you. I'm grateful to you for the work that you do, because I know that the work that you do and others like you really change lives. And not only the life of a child, but the life of that entire family. And I'm so grateful for you on their behalf. So if people want to connect with you, what is the best way for them to connect with you? If they want to reach out to you for further consultation or discussions about how to support their child, what is the best way to reach you?
Sure. All of my information is on my website. And, as you know, our websites are they're constantly under construction for some reason. But my contact information, my email, as well as my phone number, the way that I run my practice is I answer my own phone. So my information is on my website, which is www.laeducationaltherapy.com. I'm also on LinkedIn if people ever just, have questions that aren't necessarily related to, something to do with working with their child. That's also a good way usually to reach me. But yeah, I'm always happy to connect, because I do think that ultimately is the only way that we're able to make things better for kids is to just be more active participants in our own small communities. So yeah, those would be the best ways to reach me.
Wonderful. And we'll put all your information in the show notes for this episode. Thank you again, Bibi. I'm so appreciative of your insight, your perspective, and for sharing your expertise with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great. Thank you.
Wow, there was so much information in this episode. What is clear to me is how committed Dr. Pirayesh is to serving kids who struggle. And that's why I was so thrilled and am so thrilled to have her as a member of the Child Nexus professional community. Our interdisciplinary community of clinicians, attorneys, and educational specialists committed to providing high-level care and support to kids who struggle. If you are a professional who works with kids who struggle with learning, processing, or social emotional challenges, DM me on Instagram and let's see if you would be a good fit for a professional Child Nexus membership. Thanks again for listening. See you next week.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.